The problem with science fiction is the science. To make an engaging speculative work, the author must not only create an interesting world, but also present it to the audience in a way that doesn't feel like a lecture, but also doesn't leave them with more questions than answers. You can't hand your audience a comprehensive history of everything that's ever happened in your world and expect them to stay engaged, but you also can't just drop them into everything and expect them to figure it out. Solutions to this problem include adding an audience stand-in who needs everything explained to them, having the focal character be as new to everything as we are, inserting brief bits of exposition into descriptive sections, and the one I'm going to talk about today, Boyfailure Protagonist. Naturally, one of the most important parts of any literary work is the focal character. They're the lens through which the audience interacts with the story, the person will be spending the most time with. If you try to center the story on a paragon, it complicates the matter of telling it significantly. If your main character has no flaws, you can't rely on those to drive conflict or create tension. Stories that do have paragons in leading roles often build them up with a supporting cast in order to play on the group dynamic where the focal character's internal dynamic doesn't suffice. In speculative fiction, the problem of the paragon is compounded by the problem I mentioned earlier. If your focal character already knows everything about their world, there's even less room for the audience to know what's going on. The boy failure protagonist keeps his distance from the issues of the paragon and opens up an avenue for the audience to learn about the setting. To be a boy failure, you do not have to be a man, nor do you have to be masculine. However, for the sake of simplicity, I'll be using he, him for our boy failure examples. You have to be boyish. Anyone who is boyish and failing is a boy failure, regardless of gender. Boyishness is a certain vibe that is difficult to explain but may consist of being stubborn, naive, easily frustrated, annoying, though that's subjective, high energy, ambitious. It might also involve a feeling of entitlement or superiority, though not always, especially among those who qualify as failing. The failure part can be A, an actual failure to achieve a goal, B, general whininess, whether that's to characters or the audience, or C, pathetic wet cat vibes. Boyfailure Protagonist is a little more specific. He's a focal, point of view, or otherwise central male character in a story that, for whatever reason, finds himself fundamentally lacking in one or more key areas of knowledge or expertise. Obviously, he'll need to grow in that area to progress the story, and so the audience gains a method of immersion. As long as the character has something to learn, we can learn alongside him. As the main character fills in that gap, it gives us a framework that we can use to understand the rest of the premise. There are many different kinds of boys who fail, and they fail in many different ways, so let's talk about a few. Number one, the overwhelmed. This boy failure balks in the face of his task despite being capable of handling it and needs to be pushed to action by the people around him. He will most likely achieve his end goal, though not without going through a lot of character development. When met with the call to adventure, the overwhelmed will almost always refuse it and be pushed into it by other characters, and usually ends up falling into the reluctant warrior trope. Frodo Baggins is a textbook overwhelmed. He does almost no driving of the plot himself, instead being pushed by the duty of the ring and the people around him. Even when he strikes off on his own near the end of the book, Gollum and Sam end up doing most of the narrative work. Hell, Sam literally carries him into Mount Doom. Other notable examples are Terry Pratchett's Rincewind, Jace in Arcane, and Guy Montag in Fahrenheit 451. Number two, the worried. This boy failure is terrified for one reason or another. Maybe he's worried that he's not doing the right thing, or he has a secret identity that he's afraid of revealing, or he's paranoid that someone close to him is working against him. The worried is prone to self-sabotage or self-sacrifice in an effort to thwart whatever it is he's anxious about. He will frequently break off on his own as well, though that always ends poorly. Most versions of Peter Parker fall under the worried, as well as Danny Phantom, and even Harry Potter and Edward Cullen. Number three, the determined. This boy failure's concerns are in a league above him. He's probably capable of overcoming them, but it's going to be a hard fight. Nonetheless, he's determined to beat the odds and save the world, or whatever he needs to do. Like the overwhelmed, this boy failure will typically succeed and have a happy ending, but the determined is both less obviously capable and more passionate with regard to his goal. The determined will gain skill through the course of the story, frequently being the recipient of some kind of power-up, but not before he fails repeatedly. Edward Elric becomes the determined after he finds out about the big bad. Other determineds include Ezra Bridger in Star Wars Rebels and Chai in Hi-Fi Rush. There's also Genly Ai, the main character of Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness. I'll talk more about him later. Number four, the pathetic. This boy failure is a fusion of the determined and the overwhelmed. He does not possess the skill required to reach his goal, nor does he have the determination required to persevere anyway. He often complains about the task he must complete and is likely to be a nuisance to other characters. He is guaranteed to be forced into the main character role against his will and usually does little to further the plot himself unless absolutely forced to. Hamlet is the pathetic, and you could count Ron Weasley and Bilbo Baggins if you really want to. The most clear-cut example of the pathetic, though, is Snowman in Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, another one I'll get to later. The final two types both usually get overcome by character development, often very early on in the story. Sometimes they become other types of boy failures, sometimes they fall into different tropes entirely, but the process of change they go through still fills the same narrative purpose as any other boy failure's development, to give the audience an in to the author's world building. Number 5, the fraud. This boy failure is not who he claims to be, and that gets revealed when he's called to the plot. Maybe he's lied about some great achievement, or he's not actually the descendant of any great kings, or he totally could have fixed the town's problems if he wanted to, or maybe he isn't doing anything and that dragon just isn't attacking because it doesn't feel like it. Whatever it is, he's terrified that it's going to be uncovered and he'll lose everything. Though how much that shines through varies. Stark in Frieren is a fraud that becomes a determined. Bilbo Baggins starts as a fraud because of Gandalf. Johnny Truant in House of Leaves and Harold Hill in The Music Man are both frauds as well. Number 6, the pawn. This boy failure is almost, if not entirely, under someone else's control at the beginning of the story. Maybe their benevolent mentor is actually the big bad. Maybe the country they love is an evil empire seeking to take over the world. Maybe they're being manipulated by someone close to them. Pawns can react in a variety of ways to the revelation that they're working with the bad guys, but the protagonist pawn will usually turn around and start to work with the heroes. However, in villain protagonist or prequel stories, the pawn may end up falling completely to the bad guys. Anakin Skywalker is a perfect pawn example. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but it should be enough to get the point across. Boy failure protagonists are valuable narrative tools because they allow the audience an into the speculative world. Whatever area the main character is weakest in tends to be the area the audience gets to be most familiar with, since that's usually the area that sees the most development over the course of the story. So a boy failure with a well-oriented failure becomes an easy way for an author to show their audience their world. I said I'd get to Genly Eye and Snowman later, so let's talk about them. Genly Eye, Envoy of the Ecumen, or as I like to call it, the Space EU, is a guy so phenomenally bad at his job that he manages to get kicked out of the first country he lands in and sent to a work camp in the second. While this means his efforts to get the nations of a certain planet Gethin to join the Ecumen are kind of a disaster, it also makes sure the audience gets to fully understand the depths of Karhaidish and Orgoda culture. And hey, he does succeed by the end of the book, even if it's mostly not because of him. Right off the bat, Gethenians need explanation. They're a species of sexless humanoids that, instead of being constantly male or female, enter a period called Kemer that's compared to the estrus cycle. During Kemer, any Gethenian could become male or female, and any two Gethenians can get together and do the deeds. Hormones and pheromones will ensure there is a male and a female in every pair. Our human boy Genly, however, cannot grasp the concept of a genderless society, or apparently any non-patriarchal society, so he remarks on the strangeness of Gethenians frequently. Frequent comments mean that he tells the audience a lot about Gethenian physiology and culture that we wouldn't otherwise get. In Karhide, Le Guin needs a way to explain to the audience the social prestige/personal pride system of Shifgithor that dictates how people operate. Genly Eye's perpetual confusion and struggle to comprehend it means that the finer details of the system can be explained both explicitly and implicitly all the time. If he'd just gotten it immediately, the audience would have no real way of understanding Shifgithor. In Orgrain, Genly no longer has the character he's been leaning on, Thirimharth Remir Estraven, to support him. Without a guide, Genly has to figure out Orgoda culture from scratch, and on top of that has to navigate a bureaucracy. Through his attempt, which does eventually fail, the audience gains insight into what features of culture are Karhaidish versus Gethenian, and even more about Gethenian psychology. On top of that, when he gets sent to a work camp, we're given a look into Orgoda's systems of punishment. Overall, if Genly Eye had been able to convince Karhide to join the Ecumen without ever going to Orgarain, let alone out on the ice, not only would the story be a lot shorter and less interesting, but the audience would also not have nearly as many windows into Le Guin's world building as we do. Jimmy Snowman. First name Jimmy, last name never actually given. Jimmy, who goes by Snowman post-apocalypse, is difficult to like, on purpose. Jimmy's the kind of guy to play up the pathos to get with girls that have an I can fix him complex, and then when he gets bored, he whines so hard they leave. What a dude. Jimmy's mental state isn't the only thing he's failing in, though. As the book puts it, he's a words person in a world built for numbers people, and not a very good one at that. He's never been an academic person, which means that he ends up going to the sucky lamo school while his friend Craig, who might be a worse person, but it's kind of hard to tell, gets to go to the big name super nerd college and get a good job. Through communications between the two, we see more of the world than we would if we pursued the story through the eyes of, say, Craig. There are other reasons we don't see through Craig's eyes, though, namely the fact that he, doesn't make it into the present with Snowman. When Craig's plan to kill literally everyone and replace them with better versions of humans goes through, Jimmy is one of the very few people that survive, and the only person we see in the present until almost the end of the book. His unhealthy attachment to the past keeps him unable to thrive in the post apocalyptic world, but it allows us as the audience to know how things got to this point. The book alternates between flashback and present, showing us the story of how Snowman got here as well as what he's doing now. If Snowman was able to get over his past and live fully in the now, the audience would be hard pressed to figure out what went on that made things the way they are. This video is shorter than I wanted, but then again, it'd probably be several hours long if I didn't have a deadline. So there you go, an explanation of boy failure protagonists and speculative fiction. It was a lot of fun to make this video, so I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll leave you with a question that no one I've talked to seems to agree on. Is Paul Atreides a boy failure protagonist?